The red dust of Ouagadougou swirled like ancestral spirits around Colonel Ibrahim Traoré's boots as he stood beneath the ancient baobab tree where his grandfather once told stories of warriors who rode lightning across the heavens. The irony was not lost on him. Today he would either become such a warrior or die trying. Baba, the spirit's whisper of change, Traoré murmured in more, his weathered hands tracing the bark that had witnessed 3 generations of his bloodline. The tree's massive trunk, hollow with age and wisdom, seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the continent itself. Behind him, the roar of engines split the morning air. Not the foreign jets that had buzzed overhead like metal vultures for decades, dropping their payloads of democracy and liberation, but something different. Something theirs. Colonel? Captain Aminata Kone's voice cut through his meditation, urgent as a war drum. Her Fulani heritage showed in the proud set of her shoulders, the way she carried herself like a queen even in military fatigues. The first squadron is ready for inspection. Traoré turned, his dark eyes reflecting years of humiliation, of watching his people's skies violated by those who called themselves liberators while they looted the very ground beneath African feet. At 53, his hair had gone silver at the temples, not from age but from carrying the weight of a continent's dreams on his shoulders. Naiwa, he said in more, it is time. But then, switching to the French that still tasted like the colonizer's salt on his tongue, show me our thunder, Aminata. They walked through the compound that had once been a French colonial airbase, its buildings scarred by decades of foreign occupation. Traoré had chosen this place deliberately where the colonizers had once projected their power. Africa would now spread her wings. The first hangar doors groaned open like the mouth of Anansi preparing to speak truth to power. Inside, gleaming like ancestral spears blessed by lightning, stood 12 aircraft unlike anything the world had seen. They were not copies of Western designs, not hand-me-downs from former masters, but something born from African genius and forged in the furnaces of necessity. Wallahi, breathed Captain Kone, unconsciously reverting to Arabic as wonder overtook her military composure. They are beautiful. The aircraft stood in formation like a pride of metal lions, their swept wings painted in the colors of the Continental flag: green for the land, gold for the mineral wealth, red for the blood spilled in freedom's name. But it was their design that spoke of revolution. Solar panels integrated seamlessly into the wing surfaces caught the morning light, while biofuel engines promised flight powered by African crops rather than foreign oil. Each one, Traoré said, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy, represents a village that will no longer fear the sky. Each pilot, a child who will grow up knowing that the heavens belong to us as much as the earth. Engineer Kwame Asante emerged from beneath one of the aircraft, his Kentcloth headband stark against his grease-stained overalls. The Ghanaian's hands moved like those of a master drummer as he gestured toward the engine housing. Nana Traoré, he said, using the honorific that acknowledged Traoré as an elder worthy of respect. The biosynthetic engines are performing beyond projections. We are no longer dependent on their fuel, their maintenance contracts, their permission to defend ourselves. Traoré nodded, but his expression remained grave. Building the aircraft had been the easy part, liberation always was. It was what came after that tested the soul of a revolution. How long, he asked, before they notice? Asante's smile faded. The satellite images are already being analyzed in Brussels, Paris, Washington. I give us 72 hours before the first diplomatic inquiries begin. And after that? After that, the ancestors will judge whether we were worthy of the lightning they placed in our hands. That evening, as the sun painted the sky the color of traditional kola nut, Traoré sat in his quarters listening to Bakary Senghor, the base's official historian but in truth something far older, a griot, a keeper of stories, a voice that connected the present to the deep wells of African memory. Bakary's fingers danced across the strings of his kora, each note a thread in the tapestry of tale he wove. His voice, aged like fine palm wine, carried across the small room where maps of African airspace competed for wall space with traditional masks and family photographs. Écoute-moi bien, my brother, Bakary said, his Mandinka accent giving weight to his French words. I will tell you of Sundiata Keita, who forged the Mali Empire not with the sword alone, but with the wisdom to know when the iron must sing and when the tongue must speak truth to those who mistake lions for house cats. Traoré poured 2 glasses of bissap juice, the hibiscus flower staining the liquid red as blood, red as the African sun. Tell me, old man. But speak of today's lions, not yesterday's. Bakary's laugh was like wind through dry grass. The lion is always the same, nephew. Only the hunters change their weapons. He set down the kora and fixed Traoré with eyes that had seen too much of history's repetitions. This morning I received a call from my cousin in Dakar. French military attaches are asking questions about supply chains, about metals that have gone missing from mining operations, about scientists who have disappeared from their laboratories. And nothing surprises those who remember their history. When we fought for independence with words and protest, they gave us flags and presidents who danced to their music. When Sankara tried to feed his people without their grain, they found a bullet for his heart. When Gaddafi spoke of an African currency backed by gold instead of their paper promises. He fell, Traore finished quietly. Exactly. He fell because he forgot the oldest lesson our griots teach. The wise king does not announce his strength until his enemies are already in chains. Traore stood and walked to the window, where the silhouettes of his aircraft stood guard against the star-drunk sky. But what if silence means watching our people remain defenseless? What if the time for whispers has passed? Bakery joined him at the window, his weathered hand falling on Traore's shoulder like a blessing. Then you must be louder than thunder and quicker than lightning. But remember, son of my heart, the storm that announces itself gives the wise man time to find shelter. As if summoned by his words, Aminata appeared in the doorway, her expression carved from urgency. Colonel, we have intercepted communications. 3 NATO surveillance drones are being redirected toward our coordinates. Estimated arrival, 6 hours. Traore felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like his grandfather's ceremonial robe. Then it begins. The pre-dawn darkness lay heavy over the base like a mourning cloth when Traore made his way to the command center. The building hummed with activity as technicians prepared for what they all knew would be either Africa's proudest moment or its newest tragedy. Captain Cohn met him at the entrance, her pilot's helmet tucked under her arm. The squadron is ready, mon colonel. 12 pilots, 12 aircraft, and the hopes of 1 billion people. And their fears, Traore added quietly. Don't forget those. Inside the command center, screens glowed with the green phosphorescence of radar displays and satellite feeds. The base's communications officer, Lieutenant Kofi Mensah, looked up from his console with the expression of a man who had seen lightning strike twice in the same place. Sir, we are receiving multiple signals. The drones will be in visual range in 40 minutes. But there's something else. He paused, his Ghanaian accent thickening with emotion. We are getting radio chatter from across the continent. Our people are watching. On the main screen, a map of Africa pulsed with points of light, each one representing a military base, a government compound, a university where young engineers and old generals watched to see if the dream of technological independence would live or die in the skies above Burkina Faso. Mungawangu, whispered Dr. Amara Diouf, the base's chief strategist, her Wolof-accented French barely audible. From Cairo to Cape Town, they are waiting to see if we are worthy of our ancestors' sacrifice. Traore studied the tactical display where 3 red dots crept steadily toward their position. NATO reconnaissance drones, officially on a routine monitoring mission, but in reality conducting the opening moves of what might become Africa's final test of sovereignty. Aminata, he said, his voice carrying the authority of generations of warriors, take your squadron up. Show them what thunder sounds like when it speaks with an African voice. She saluted, her fist to her heart in the traditional gesture of respect. Inshallah, we will make the ancestors proud. As the pilots filed out toward their aircraft, Bakery appeared at Traore's elbow, his ancient face grave with prophecy. I have been listening to the radio signals from Dakar, from Lagos, from Nairobi. The young ones are calling this Traore's thunder. They are painting your name on walls, making songs of your aircraft. And if we fail? If you fail, the songs will become dirges. But if you succeed? The old griot's eyes gleamed with the light of distant fires. If you succeed, this day will be remembered when the pyramids are dust and the Sahara is green again. Outside, the first engines began to sing not the harsh scream of foreign technology, but something deeper, more resonant, like the voice of the earth itself rising to challenge the sky. The biofuel engines purred with a sound that spoke of palm oil and possibility, of African minds freed from the necessity of begging for scraps from their former masters' tables. Allahu Akbar, murmured one of the technicians, a Hausa man whose grandfather had fought the French in Niger. They fly with the breath of Africa in their wings. On the radar screens, 12 green dots rose from the base like prayers ascending to heaven. Each aircraft carried not just weapons and fuel, but the accumulated dreams of every African child who had ever looked up to see foreign jets streak overhead and wondered why their sky belonged to others. At 30,000 feet above the Sahel, Captain Aminata Cohn felt the weight of history in her hands as she gripped the controls of her aircraft. Below, the landscape of her ancestors spread out like a vast Kent cloth, patterns of green and gold where the savanna met cultivated fields, threads of silver where rivers carried life through the ancient earth. "Thunder leader to all units," she broadcast, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "We are approaching intercept coordinates. Remember, we are not just pilots today, we are the voice of every African who has been told the sky is not ours to claim." Through her headset came the voices of her squadron, Yoruba and Hausa and Swahili and Amharic, French and English and Arabic and Portuguese, all united in the single purpose of proving that African hands could guide African wings through African skies. "Thunder 3 ready?" That was Lieutenant Diallo, a Senegalese pilot whose grandmother had hidden weapons for the resistance fighters. "Thunder 7, Hakuna Matata." Lieutenant Mwangi's Kikuyu accent carried the casual confidence of a man who had learned to fly by watching eagles hunt over the Rift Valley. "Thunder 12, we day ready." Lieutenant Okafor's Igbo-inflected pidgin brought smiles to his squadron mates. He was the joker of the group, but his flying was poetry written in contrails. On her tactical display, Aminata could see the 3 NATO drones approaching from the north, their profiles stark against the deep blue of the African sky. These were not the crude surveillance platforms that had buzzed over wedding parties and school compounds and other conflicts. These were cutting-edge technology, worth more than the GDP of some African nations, crammed with sensors that could read the serial numbers on a rifle from 50 miles away. "Thunder leader to base," she called. "Visual contact with bogies. They are magnificent." In the command center, Traore felt his heart skip as he listened to his pilots encounter the full technological might of their former colonizers. These drones represented everything his people had been told they could never achieve: advanced materials, precision engineering, artificial intelligence systems that could make split-second decisions faster than human thought. "Steady, Aminata," he murmured into his headset. "Show them that the student has become the teacher." What happened next would be debated in military academies and diplomatic chambers for decades to come. The NATO drones, programmed to expect conventional intercept patterns, suddenly found themselves facing something their algorithms had never encountered: aircraft that moved like birds of prey, that seemed to anticipate their maneuvers before their computers had calculated them. "Subhanallah," breathed Lieutenant Keita, his Malian accent thick with amazement. "They fly like machines, but we fly like we are the sky itself." Aminata watched her tactical display as her squadron wove through the air around the drones in patterns that spoke of more than military training. These were movements learned from watching hawks spiral over the Bandiagara cliffs, from observing how lightning danced between clouds during the rainy season, from understanding that flight was not conquest of the air but harmony with it. The lead drone began evasive maneuvers, its sophisticated AI calculating threat vectors and optimal escape routes. But for every digital thought it processed, Aminata's squadron seemed to have already found the answer written in the wind itself. "Mechanical bird," Lieutenant Okafor called out cheerfully as he swept past the drone's camera array. "You fly like you learned from textbooks. We learned from the ancestors who rode the wind before your makers were born." In Brussels, NATO command centers erupted in confusion as their most advanced surveillance platforms found themselves utterly outmaneuvered by aircraft that shouldn't have existed, piloted by people they had dismissed as recipients of foreign aid rather than masters of their own technological destiny. "Sir," one technician reported to a room full of generals whose understanding of Africa had just been fundamentally challenged, "the bogies they're playing with our drones. Like cats with mice." But in the skies over West Africa, what looked like play was actually something far more serious. A demonstration that the age of technological colonialism was ending, that African minds were no longer content to be consumers of innovation created elsewhere. Back at the base, Bakary stood in the shadow of the great baobab tree, his ancient hands pressed against its bark as if drawing strength from the generations of his people who had sought wisdom beneath its branches. Around him, off-duty personnel gathered in the traditional circle, their faces turned skyward where contrails wrote new stories across the African heavens. "Listen," the old griot said, his voice carrying the cadence of countless fireside tales. "Do you hear it? The sky itself is singing." Above them, the 12 aircraft of Thunder Squadron danced their aerial ballet around the NATO drones, each maneuver a statement written in physics and courage. But more than that, each pilot carried in their heart the knowledge that they were not just flying machines, they were carrying the dreams of every African who had ever looked up at foreign aircraft and wondered when their children would command such power. Lieutenant Yassine Touré, whose Tuareg heritage showed in the way she seemed to navigate by instinct rather than instruments, swept her aircraft through a rolling climb that brought gasps from the watching crowd below. Her voice crackled through the radio with the accent of the desert winds. "By the 7 veils of the Sahara, these metal birds of theirs are fast, but they have no soul." In the command center, Traore watched the tactical display with the intensity of a man watching his own judgment unfold. Each successful maneuver by his pilots was a vindication of the dream that had driven him to this moment. The dream that Africans could forge their own destiny from their own resources, guided by their own wisdom. Dr. Diouf appeared at his shoulder, her tablet displaying intercepted communications from military installations across 3 continents. "Colonel, the reactions are significant. Pentagon traffic is calling this unprecedented capability demonstration. The French are scrambling analysts to understand how we achieved this level of technology. The Chinese are requesting immediate diplomatic consultations. And our people?" Her smile was like a sunrise over the Niger River. "Demonstrations in Lagos, celebrations in Accra, impromptu parades in Dakar. The youth are calling this the beginning of the African century." On his headset, Aminata's voice carried the controlled excitement of a professional doing something history would remember. "Thunder leader to base. The mechanical birds are returning to their roost. They have seen what they came to see." Indeed, the NATO drones had begun their withdrawal, their mission complete, but their operators' understanding of African capabilities fundamentally altered. The surveillance footage they carried would reach analysts who had spent their careers studying African military assets measured in outdated equipment and limited training. Today, those assumptions had been burned away like morning mist before the desert sun. "Thunder Squadron, form up for return to base," Aminata commanded. "Today we have shown the world that the sky recognizes no colonial borders." As the 12 aircraft descended toward their home airfield, each pilot carried the knowledge that they had participated in something larger than military exercise or political demonstration. They had been the instruments through which their continent had declared its technological independence, the voices through which Africa had announced that it would no longer be content to be a market for others' innovations. 3 days later, Traore stood in his office reading diplomatic cables that arrived like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The international response to Thunder Squadron's demonstration had been swift and predictable, a mixture of barely concealed alarm wrapped in the language of concern for regional stability. Captain Cohn entered with a folder thick with intelligence reports, her expression carrying the weight of unwelcome news. "The response from our former friends has been comprehensive," she said, setting the documents on his desk. Traore scanned the top summary: trade agreements suddenly requiring additional review, military cooperation programs placed under evaluation, foreign aid packages experiencing procedural delays. The economic pressure was as predictable as it was cruel, the same playbook used against every African leader who had dared to dream of genuine independence. "They seek to strangle us slowly," he observed, his voice carrying no surprise, only the weariness of a man who had seen this script performed too many times. But there is more." Aminata's finger traced down to a marked section. "Intelligence suggests they are planning something more direct. The same pattern we saw before Sankara fell, before Lumumba was murdered, before every African leader who forgot that our former masters prefer us grateful rather than capable," Traore finished. He walked to the window where he could see his aircraft lined up like metal prayers against the evening sky. "How long do we have?" Dr. Diouf's voice came from the doorway where she had been listening. "Based on historical patterns, perhaps weeks. They will try economic pressure first, then diplomatic isolation, then." She let the sentence hang unfinished, but they all knew the history she referenced. Bakary appeared as if summoned by the gravity of the moment, his kora slung across his back like a warrior's bow. "I have been consulting the old stories," he said, settling into a chair with the careful movements of age. "Do you know the tale of the spider who challenged the storm?" Despite everything, Traore smiled. "Tell us, old father." Anansi the spider saw that the storm brought terror to the forest creatures, so he wove a web stronger than any that had come before. When the storm struck, his web caught the lightning itself and turned it into light for his people. Bakary's eyes glinted with meaning. But the storm was angry that its power had been captured, so it gathered all its brothers from across the sky to destroy the spider's web. And what did Anansi do? What spiders have always done when faced with impossible odds. The old man's smile carried generations of accumulated wisdom. He made his web larger. Traore considered this, watching the last light of day fade over his revolutionary air force. In the growing darkness, he could see the lights of villages scattered across the landscape, millions of people who had lived their entire lives under the shadow of foreign aircraft that represented power they could never hope to challenge. Kwame, he called to the engineer who had been working late in the hangar, his silhouette visible through the windows. How quickly can we expand production? Asante looked up from the engine he had been adjusting, his face streaked with the honest sweat of a man building the future with his own hands. Nana, with the resources we have now, perhaps 6 aircraft per month. But if we could access the full mineral wealth of the continent, if we could unite the engineering talent from Cairo to Johannesburg, then we could build a web large enough to catch all the lightning in the sky, Traore murmured, understanding dawning in his voice. That night, as his staff worked to prepare for the storm they all knew was coming, Traore composed a message that would either unite a continent or mark his own death warrant. The letter began with traditional greetings in Arabic, French, English, Portuguese and Swahili, but its contents were revolutionary. To my brothers and sisters who lead the nations of Africa, I write to you under skies that have known foreign dominion too long. Today we have shown that African minds can forge African solutions to African challenges. Tomorrow we can show the world that the continent of our ancestors is ready to reclaim its place among the powers of the earth. 6 weeks after the first demonstration, delegations began arriving in Ouagadougou like tributaries flowing toward a great river. They came quietly, officially visiting for agricultural conferences or cultural exchanges, but Traore knew they were answering his call to weave Anansi's web across the entire continent. The first to arrive was General Amina Hassan from Sudan, a woman whose reputation for tactical brilliance had earned her respect even from those who opposed her politics. She stood in the hangar examining the Thunder Squadron aircraft with the intensity of a master craftsman studying another's work. Bismillah, she murmured, running her hand along the solar panel arrays integrated into the wing surfaces. When my intelligence officers told me what you had accomplished, I thought they were repeating propaganda. And now? Traore asked. Her smile was sharp as a Sudanese blade. Now I understand why the Americans are repositioning 3 carrier battle groups and the French are conducting training exercises in Chad. By evening, the delegation had grown to include representatives from 12 African nations. They gathered in the base's conference room, but the atmosphere was more reminiscent of a traditional council of elders than a modern military briefing. Dr. Diouf had arranged the seating in a circle, with maps of Africa covering the walls like the ancestors' blessings. My friends, Traore began, speaking first in Arabic, then French, then English, ensuring his words could reach every heart in the room, we gather at a moment when history offers us a choice. We can continue to be customers for technology created in laboratories that have never felt African soil, or we can become the authors of our own technological destiny. General Kweku Nkrumah from Ghana, named for the great independence leader, leaned forward with the intensity of a man who had spent his career watching foreign aircraft patrol skies his own pilots were forbidden to defend. The question, my brother, is whether we have the industrial capacity to make such dreams reality. Engineer Asante, who had been invited to address the gathering, rose with the careful dignity of a man carrying profound knowledge. With respect, General, that question assumes scarcity where abundance exists. Africa contains 60% of the world's cobalt, 30% of its bauxite, 20% of its iron ore. We have uranium in Niger, rare earth elements in Congo, titanium in South Africa. The only scarcity is in our willingness to use these gifts for our own advancement. Colonel Fatima al-Rashid from Algeria, her desert-weathered face thoughtful, spoke of the challenge they all understood. Resources mean nothing without the knowledge to use them. How do we compete with research and development programs that have decades of investment? Dr. Diouf activated a large display screen that showed a map of African universities and research institutions. We begin by acknowledging what we already possess. The University of Cape Town has materials science programs that rival any in Europe. Cairo University's engineering faculty has produced innovations in renewable energy that the West has adopted without credit. The University of Ibadan's computer science department has created algorithms that power applications used worldwide. Wallahi, breathed General Hassan, we have been thinking like separated fingers when we could be a closed fist. Bakery, who had been quietly observing from his corner, rose with the slow majesty of age and wisdom. If I may, honored leaders, I would tell you a story. Without waiting for permission, he continued in the way of griots who know that some truths can only be carried in tales. Long ago, when the kingdoms of West Africa controlled the gold trade, Arab merchants would arrive with salt and horses, seeking to exchange them for African gold. But the Africans were clever, they would only trade gold dust for salt grain by grain, ensuring they received fair value. The Arabs complained that this was inefficient, that they could process larger quantities if the Africans would simply trust them. The old man's eyes glinted with ancient humor. Of course, when the Africans began trading gold in larger quantities, they discovered the merchants had been cheating them all along. The lesson, my children, is that we must control not just the resources, but the entire process from earth to sky. General Krumah nodded slowly. Vertical integration. From mining to manufacturing to deployment. Exactly, Traore said. But more than that, horizontal integration as well. When one nation lacks titanium, another provides it. When one lacks technical expertise, another shares it. We become not competitors for foreign scraps, but partners in continental advancement. The discussion continued deep into the night, voices rising and falling like the rhythm of traditional drums as practical details were hammered out. Production centers would be established in regions with the necessary mineral resources. Aircraft engines in Nigeria where petroleum expertise could be adapted to biofuels, electronics in South Africa where mining had created advanced materials processing capabilities, final assembly in multiple locations to ensure no single point of failure. How long, asked Colonel al-Rashid, before they try to stop us permanently? The room fell silent, everyone understanding the weight of history her question carried. African leaders who had challenged the established order too boldly had a tendency to meet unfortunate ends: car accidents, sudden illnesses, coups by concerned military officers, who somehow always seemed to have foreign support. Traoré's answer came quietly, but with the finality of a judge pronouncing the sentence. They are already trying. Economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, intelligence operations to find weaknesses they can exploit. But this time is different. How? Because this time, we are not one leader they can eliminate or one nation they can isolate. We are a web spanning the continent, and if they cut one strand, the others grow stronger. The attack came at dawn 3 months later, preceded by the kind of diplomatic theater that had become as predictable as sunrise. Intelligence reports of weapons shipments to terrorist groups, concerns about regional stability, credible threats that required immediate international intervention. Traoré was in the command center reviewing flight schedules when the first cruise missiles appeared on radar, launched from submarines that officially didn't exist in waters that were supposedly international. The strikes were precise, targeted, designed to eliminate Thunder Squadron without the messiness of a full-scale invasion. Allah preserve us, whispered Lieutenant Mensah as he watched the incoming missiles track toward their coordinates. 12 bogies, high velocity, targeting the hangars. But Bakery's lessons about spider webs had been well learned. As the first explosions bloomed like deadly flowers across the primary airfield, 60 kilometers away a second base came online, one that existed in no official records. Built with the patient cooperation of a dozen African nations who had learned to prepare for the storms that followed thunderclaps. Thunder leader to all call signs, Aminata's voice crackled through the radio from the hidden base. The web holds. Repeat, the web holds. Within minutes, 24 aircraft lifted off from concealed runways scattered across 5 countries, not just the original Thunder Squadron design, but improved versions incorporating lessons learned from the first encounters. Solar panel efficiency had been increased, biofuel engines refined, and most importantly, each aircraft now carried defensive systems based on traditional African knowledge of how to hunt in packs. The submarines that had launched the cruise missiles found themselves facing something their commanders had never trained for. Aircraft that moved like schools of fish, impossible to target individually because they flowed as a unified organism through the sky. Yalla, called Lieutenant Keita as his aircraft swept down toward the ocean surface. Let us show these metal sharks how the children of the Sahara hunt. What followed would be studied in military academies for generations, not for its technological sophistication, though that was considerable, but for how it demonstrated the difference between fighting with machines and fighting as part of the natural world. The African pilots moved through the sky like their ancestors had moved through the savannah, each individual part of a larger organism that thought and reacted as one. In Washington and Brussels and Paris, emergency meetings convened as their most advanced naval assets found themselves outmatched by aircraft that shouldn't have existed, flown by pilots they had dismissed as recipients of foreign aid rather than masters of indigenous innovation. Sir, reported one analyst to a room full of officials whose understanding of African capabilities was being revolutionized in real time, we are receiving multiple reports of similar aircraft operating over Niger, Chad, Mali, Sudan. It appears the entire Sahel region has been militarized overnight. The truth was more profound than simple militarization. What had emerged was the first truly African military technology, not copied from foreign designs, not dependent on foreign maintenance, not vulnerable to foreign sanctions, but grown from African soil and powered by African innovation. In the weeks following what international media called the Sahel incident, carefully avoiding words like defeat or rout, the transformation of African airspace accelerated beyond even Traoré's most optimistic projections. The University of Lagos announced a breakthrough in biosynthetic aviation fuel that could be produced from cassava and palm oil. The University of Witwatersrand revealed advanced materials research that made aircraft lighter and stronger than anything produced elsewhere. Research centers from Casablanca to Cape Town published papers on aerodynamics that drew inspiration from studying how insects native to Africa had solved the challenges of flight. Laughed Dr. Amara Diouf as she reviewed the intelligence reports flooding in from around the continent. They thought they were fighting a military force. Instead, they were fighting an idea whose time had come. Traoré stood on the observation deck of the new Continental Aerospace headquarters, a facility that had risen from the red earth of Burkina Faso like a technological pyramid, its design incorporating traditional African architectural principles with cutting-edge engineering. Below, the runway stretched toward the horizon, busy with aircraft that represented the dreams of a billion people made manifest in metal and composites. Thunder leader requesting permission to land, came Aminata's voice through the tower radio. She was returning from a training mission over Lake Chad, where pilots from 6 nations had practiced the collective flight patterns that had proven so effective against conventional military thinking. As her aircraft touched down, Traoré could see the changes that months of flying African skies had brought to his people. They moved with a confidence that came from knowing they were no longer defenseless, no longer dependent on the goodwill of others for their protection. General Hassan approached across the tarmac, her uniform bearing the new insignia of the Continental Defense Force, a baobab tree whose roots and branches formed the outline of the African continent. Ibrahim, we have received the response from the United Nations. Traoré took the document she offered, though he already knew what it would contain. Demands for inspections, requirements for technology sharing, threats of sanctions if Africa refused to limit its newfound capabilities. The same playbook that had been used to keep African nations dependent since independence. And our response? Hassan's smile carried the confidence of a woman who had spent her career watching her people's skies violated by foreign aircraft. We invited them to send their inspectors in their own aircraft, if they can find pilots brave enough to fly through airspace defended by people who learned to hunt from their ancestors. The psychological shift was as important as the technological one. For generations, African children had grown up seeing foreign military aircraft overhead and understanding them as symbols of their own powerlessness. Now, a new generation looked up to see aircraft painted with the colors of their own flags, flown by pilots who shared their languages and their dreams. Bakery emerged from the headquarters building, his ancient frame moving with the careful dignity of age but his eyes bright with satisfaction. I have been listening to the radio stations from across the continent, he announced. The children are singing new songs. What do they sing, old father? They sing of thunder that speaks with African voices, of lightning that dances to African rhythms, of skies that belong to the children of the soil rather than the children of distant shores. His voice carried the weight of prophecy fulfilled. They sing the song of Anansi's web, grown large enough to catch the storm itself. 1 year after Thunder Squadron's first flight, Traoré stood once again beneath the great baobab where his grandfather had told stories of warriors who rode lightning. But now the tree's shadow fell across a transformed landscape, runways and hangars, research facilities and training centers, all integrated into the natural environment like technological fruit growing from African soil. The morning sky was busy with aircraft painted in the colors of 43 African nations, their biofuel engines singing harmonies that spoke of palm oil and possibility, of minds freed from the necessity of begging for scraps from foreign tables. Each contrail was a declaration written in physics and courage. The sky belongs to those brave enough to claim it. Baba, Traoré whispered to the ancient tree, his hand pressed against bark that had witnessed the birth of something unprecedented in human history, a technological revolution that drew its strength not from conquest but from cooperation, not from exploitation but from indigenous innovation. Captain Cohn approached through the morning light, her pilot suit bearing the new patches that marked her as an instructor in the Continental Flight Academy. Behind her walked a group of young cadets, Yoruba and Kikuyu, Berber and Zulu, Hausa and Amharic speakers, all united in their determination to master the skies above their ancestral lands. Colonel, she said, the title carrying new weight now that it represented not just military rank but continental leadership. The morning class is ready for their first solo flights. Traoré watched the young pilots file toward their aircraft, not the revolutionary prototypes of a year ago, but sleek production models that rolled off assembly lines in Accra and Lagos, Johannesburg and Cairo. Each aircraft was a synthesis of traditional African knowledge and cutting-edge technology, powered by crops grown in African soil and guided by navigation systems that understood the continent's unique geography. "Do you remember," he asked Aminata, "when we thought 12 aircraft would be enough to change the world?" Her laugh carried the joy of a woman who had lived to see impossible dreams become everyday reality. "Now we graduate 12 pilots every week, and they return to defend skies from Dakar to Mogadishu." In the distance, the first student aircraft lifted off, its biofuel engine singing with the voice of African innovation. The pilot, a young woman from Tanzania whose grandmother had hidden ammunition for Mau Mau fighters, guided her aircraft into the morning sky with movements that spoke of harmony rather than conquest. Dr. Diouf joined them beneath the baobab, her tablet displaying statistics that would have seemed like fantasy just months earlier. Continental production is now at 300 aircraft per month. The technology-sharing agreements have eliminated our dependence on foreign components. And the economic impact. She paused, searching for words adequate to the transformation. "We are witnessing the birth of the first truly indigenous African industrial revolution." Bakery materialized from the shade of the great tree, his kora slung across his back, his ancient eyes bright with satisfaction. "The ancestors are pleased," he announced with the authority of one who spoke with voices across the centuries. "Last night I dreamed of Sundiata Keita, and he told me the Empire of Mali has awakened in a new form." Above them, more aircraft rose into the African sky, not the lone squadron of desperate revolutionaries, but the air force of a continent that had remembered its strength. Each pilot carried forward the knowledge that they were not just defending airspace, but maintaining the dignity of a billion people who had waited too long to see their skies commanded by their own hands. "Listen," said Bakery, his griot's ear attuned to sounds others might miss. "Do you hear it?" They stood in silence beneath the baobab, listening to the symphony of engines that had become the new soundtrack of African independence. But beyond the mechanical sounds, there was something else. The whisper of wind through leaves, the distant voices of children playing in villages that no longer feared the sky, the soft percussion of feet on ancient paths where people walked with heads held high. "I hear it, old father," Traore said quietly. "It is the sound of a continent that has remembered how to fly." As the morning sun climbed higher, painting the sky the color of African gold, more aircraft continued their ascent, each one carrying forward the promise that the children of this ancient land would never again watch helplessly as foreign wings wrote stories of dominance across their heavens. The thunder that had begun with 12 aircraft and a dream had grown into lightning that danced from the Mediterranean to the Cape, from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. And beneath the great baobab tree where his grandfather had once told stories of impossible things, Ibrahim Traoré smiled as he watched those stories take flight. The age of begging for protection was over. The age of African thunder had begun. In radio broadcasts from Lagos to Luanda, in text messages from Cairo to Cape Town, in songs sung by children who had never known a sky they could not claim, the same phrase echoed across the continent like a prayer finally answered. Traoré's thunder flies for all of us. And in the growing network of airfields and academies, research centers and manufacturing facilities that stretched across 43 nations, a new generation of African pilots and engineers continued the work of proving that the sky recognizes no colonial borders, only the courage of those bold enough to claim their rightful place among the clouds. The spider's web had grown large enough to catch all the lightning in the sky, and Africa flew free.